So we're ready to get started. So for those of you new to ITSM Academy, here's a quick overview. ITSM Academy is a full-service provider of IT service management education. We develop all content in-house. This includes all ITIL education, as well as process design, Agile, and DevOps. Since 2003, we've trained and certified tens of thousands of students. Now let's introduce today's speaker, Lou Hunnebeck. Lou is Principal Advisor with Fruition Partners, a DXC technology company. She has over 25 years experience in IT services and education and consulting in IT service management. She has led global teams in best practice and methodology design. Lou is a frequent speaker at HDI, ITSM, ITIM, ITSMF, and other events. She's an ITIL expert, the author of ITIL Service Design 2011 edition of the library, and co-author of ITIL Practitioner Guidance. Good morning, Lou.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction.
You're welcome. And I would just like to tell our people that you are coming out with a new white paper on service portfolio, and we are going to give them an opportunity at the end of your webinar to sign up for that if they want that. Is that correct?
That's terrific. Yes, absolutely. It's a short series. There'll be 2 of them, and the first one will be coming out probably within the next couple of weeks.
Perfect. And are you ready for me to make you presenter?
Let's go for it.
Okay.
Here we are. So, all right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're participating from. It's a pleasure to speak with you all today. This is our agenda. We're going to have one introductory slide. So we will be talking about applying the principles throughout. As Karen said, if you come up with a question or a comment or something you'd like clarification on, please go ahead and put that into the chat feature of GoToMeeting as soon as that comes to you so we don't forget. So this is all my wonderful things about me that I'm so swell. Let's move on. So what is it that we face when we're trying to change or improve or further enhance our organization, and what do we need to be able to accomplish that? Let's face it, when we're trying to make an improvement or make a change, both the people who participate in making that change as well as those who will benefit from it have a lot of concerns and demands. There are risks to be attended to. This is not a simple endeavor, but ultimately we're just trying to do something practical, accomplish something meaningful for the organization, whether large or small. And these principles can apply at any level. So if we're trying to make an improvement or run a program or an initiative, there are 5 key things that we need to have as part of that initiative and to maintain throughout the effort if we're not going to be successful. The first one is we need to have strong leadership that is visibly committed to the effort. So we have to see and hear and feel their leadership and their commitment to the effort that's underway. Another thing we need is the objectives of the effort have to be clear. They have to make sense to people. They need to be seen and experienced as being relevant to what we're doing as an organization and what we're trying to accomplish. And the people who are going to participate in executing the work and really making it happen, they have to feel that they're properly prepared to do that. They also have to be willing to participate. And so that really connects a lot to the leadership and the objectives. And also the more prepared they feel, the more likely they are to be willing to do their part. We also have to make sure that whatever we do actually demonstrates value to the organization or to the customers or end users for whom it is intended. So that idea of what will be valuable about this and making sure that's demonstrable is a critical element of success. And we have to sustain momentum. Making one isolated improvement has its value, but first of all, it's very easy to backslide. And also, even if we don't backslide, we just stop there. We're not adding more value. So we need to obtain and retain these 5 things in any effort in order to be successful. And using these guiding principles really can be helpful throughout that effort and in doing that. As complex and difficult as the technology piece of any improvement can be, really the biggest challenges are with our people, with the human factor of this. So we need to prepare our people. We need to support them, no matter what level of stakeholder they are. We need to help them to make this the best result it can possibly be. And the ways we choose to work can increase that likelihood of success. So again, this is where these guiding principles come into play, as to putting into our work methods key drivers for success that will improve that likelihood. Now, it's helpful to have kind of an organizing framework for the improvement effort. And when we were working on the ITIL Practitioner Guidance book, we decided to use the CSI approach as that kind of an organizing framework to kind of lead you through an improvement, whether there's an entire team working on it, or even if you're only working on an improvement on your own. This is a very logical approach. You know, what are you trying to accomplish? What's that vision, the mission, the objectives? What are you starting from, that current state? Where do you want to be after you've made your improvement? It may be all the way to the vision, or it may be a step to the vision, which is much more likely. And having a clear path for how to accomplish it. Then executing that path and being able to evaluate success, and then keep the momentum going on with the next improvement and the next improvement. Also, part of keeping momentum going is institutionalizing an improvement so that it becomes solidly embedded in the organization. So if we use the CSI approach or some similar approach as an organizing framework, then we can apply the guiding principles along the way, because there will be many decisions, there will be many actions that have to come during that activity, and using these principles will guide many of those decisions and actions, hence calling them guiding principles. Sounds kind of logical, doesn't it? I hope. So if you have agreed principles that everybody can sit down with together in the beginning and say, okay, when we're facing decisions, when we're choosing how to act, what will guide our decisions? What will help us decide between one action and another? If we can agree those principles up front, then making the right choices in the trenches, even when you're suffering from a lot of pressure to do something the wrong way, it's much, much easier to make those right choices. And here are the actual 9 guiding principles that we defined, and we defined these actually as part of the ITIL practitioner guidance, but I've been using these or similar ones for many, many years. This is why I kind of nudged to get that included in the practitioner guidance. So we're going to talk through these principles and see how they can be applied in the real world to really make a difference to your success. Now, these principles make sense on their own, but they also reflect the best thinking that you're going to see embedded in a lot of the different frameworks, methodologies, best practices, standards, whatever you want to call them, that are out there in the universe. And we see the names and hear the names all the time. And you may be using some of these ways of working, practices, methodologies in your organization. When we were trying to synthesize the best guidance we could possibly give, we looked at these various frameworks and methodologies, or whatever you want to call some of them, and we said, well, what are the key messages inside them? And can we kind of distill some of these key messages about how to work and use them as principles to guide action? So I think that you're going to get a sense that a lot of these things are familiar to you because they're embedded in one area or another that you're already leveraging in your organization. So let's talk through the actual principles that are on this list. No matter what you're doing, whether the initiative is about deploying an entire new service where we have a lot of discovery and design and requirements and doing the requirements analysis to match to the design, etc., or whether you're doing simple, ongoing, continual improvement, you really should have guiding principles that everyone can agree upon. And the 9 ones that we're talking about today are a great starting place. There are a set of general precepts to be followed, but you might decide that on a specific engagement, you want to add some, or you want to replace some of these with something that's very specific to the initiative you're undertaking. But the key thing is to use them, to make them a practical part of the endeavor and not just something that you talk about in the beginning and you ignore. It's kind of like what happens when an organization defines its vision or mission statement, and then you put it on a card for everybody's wallet, or you put it on posters on the wall, but no one ever actually refers to it again. No one actually uses it. That's not practical. It's a waste of time if you're not going to really use them. So let's talk about the principles and how they can help, and hopefully how you can actually use them in the real world. So principle number one, and this, I have a colleague, Stuart Rance, who is part of this development. He has a tendency of saying that they're all the most important principles, that all 9 of them are the most important ones. So we're not going to give numbers to them here. We're just going to talk about them. Focus on value is so critical. If we're undertaking some improvement or effort, there's a purpose to it. So everything we do as a service provider has to map back, if not directly, then perhaps indirectly, to value to our customers, to our end users. Now, depending on what the situation is, the customer could be a person, a group, an entire organization, or it could be some combination thereof. It really depends what is the service, who is the service provider, and then we look to see who is the beneficiary of this service or this effort that we're undertaking. And sometimes we think we're focusing on value, but sometimes what we're really looking at is our own organization as opposed to what's valuable to the customer. Let me give you an example. Let's say we're working on improving a change management process. If we're just focusing on what's going to be better for us by improving the process, oh, it'll be a little easier, it'll be less stressful. Well, that's fine, but that's just for us. How will the business or the customer benefit from the improved change management process? Will it make it possible for them to benefit from improved features because they get those features faster, because change can be done? Will they benefit from the ability to work in an uninterrupted environment because our changes are improving the quality of the systems they use? So what is the value to the customers of what we're doing, even if that value is slightly indirect? So how can we really do this throughout the course of an initiative? How can we make it real that we are focusing on value? Well, one of the ways as a leader you can do this is by embedding questions, challenging your team, asking them things like, well, okay, if we're talking about a service, will the customer be able to do something now that they can't do in the future that they can't do now because of this service? Will they be able to do something they already do, but do it better, faster, smarter, cheaper? How is this thing that we're going to do special in a way that really matters to our customers, not in a way that just matters to us? And if there are options that the customer might have, well, how is what we're going to do for them better than what they could get from someone else or in another way? The key thing is, as a leader, we need to challenge people to be thinking about this. Follow the breadcrumb trail from the activity that's being undertaken back to how does it map back to value to our customers and or end users. And as the leaders, we're the ones who have to make this real by actually embedding that into our way of thinking. The next principle is a great one. I love this one, and that is start where you are. Some organizations have a tendency, particularly on a big initiative, to want to just throw everything out and start over. Let's just start from scratch. But the key thing is don't do that unless there is a driving, compelling reason to do it. So always consider first, is there anything in current state that we can leverage as it is? Is there something available to be reused, even if we're going to enhance or build upon it? There's a lot of value to this. The start over approach can be, number one, it can be very wasteful in terms of not only time, but things that we have that we could already use, licenses, processes, people. A lot of that could have a great deal of value for us in the organization. Well, all right, if you want to start where you are, how do we do that effectively? If we keep what is working, one of the things it's going to do is going to improve acceptance of the new things that do change. It'll also show to the people involved that we're really listening to them and we're respecting the work that they already do. We're not saying, hey, you people are dreadful, you're trash, you have nothing to offer. We're saying, hey, there's good stuff here, but we can do better. So the first thing we need to do is look at what exists and do so as objectively as we possibly can. That objective current state assessment, which is, by the way, the second step of the CSI approach, it should uncover things that can be reused, whether in their current shape or perhaps they need to be revised and reshaped. That will get us our reuse strategy. When there are examples of successful practice, maybe we can replicate that, or maybe we can expand on it. We might have multiple business units globally that are doing basically the same thing, but one business unit may have innovated as part of their process, and they may have something to offer that can be used by someone else. And there you've got some built-in advocates for their approach that we could leverage. We also have to carefully assess the risks of one approach versus another. There is risk to ripping everything out and starting over, but there is also risk to reusing existing processes. We might bring along issues and concerns that go with it. We might lead people to believe that things aren't changing, that it's just the same as it was. So we have to carefully consider what those risks might be on each side and then make our choices. Now, if it does seem that we really do have to rip and replace, consider, is a drastic measure truly necessary? It is a very rare situation where we truly are starting over completely. If that happens, it's usually because the current state is so painful that we absolutely have to kind of tear that Band-Aid off and force people to reevaluate. We have to force the people to shake themselves out of old behaviors and start anew. So consider very, very carefully if that truly does need to be done. And as leaders, asking these questions and making sure we're not just assuming that we have to start over is extremely important. The next principle to discuss is called design for experience. And this is very much the case in now when we're considering what is going on for the customer. So services as well as processes, we really need to think from the outset about creating a satisfying end-to-end experience for whoever is the customer or the end user. And we want to make sure that we understand things from their perspective. Excuse me. So what is customer experience? What is user experience? If we look at this from a kind of a market perspective, it's been described in the businessdictionary.com as the entirety of the interactions the customer has with a company and its products. So if we think of ourselves in the IT organization as a service company providing its products and services to the business we serve, we can extrapolate from this definition. So if we understand that current experience is really central to overall customer relationship management, then we have the ability to leverage this information. And that experience that that customer has or that end user has, it's really how they feel about us. It can be very subjective in many ways. So how do we really make sure that we are designing for experience? Well, one of the things is we have to consider the areas where we can actually involve the customer and or the end user in the process. Maybe we're going to bring people not only in requirements gathering, maybe we're going to prototype for them, or we're going to bring them into testing, or we're going to have representatives along the way. On a big project, what I like to have is some end user representation where, let's say it's a big project, I've got 4 end user representatives. 2 of them stay with the program throughout the entire program, but 2 of them keep getting swapped out. So we get fresh eyes on what it is we're working with. So that's a very important strategy that can be quite valuable. Another approach is to make sure we think about both the objective experience and the subjective experience. So let's say we're considering someone who's ordering something from a website. And they go on the website, they find what they need, they order it, it is delivered as ordered, at the time when expected, at the price that was expected. Well, those things can be objectively measured. They are very tangible things to say, okay, we said we would do this, we did that. But there can be subjective aspects along the way. So for example, what if the navigation of the website was very, very difficult and it was annoying to the customer and it was hard for them to determine if they were getting the right thing? Well, even though they did get the right thing in the end, their overall experience might have been negative. So we have to consider both the objective and the subjective aspects of customer and user experience. Prototyping can be very valuable because giving customers and users an opportunity to really see and experience what's being developed and get that feedback really early on can be very valuable to allowing our design to consider their experience and not just functionality for us on the provider side. We should look at more than just touch points or moments of truth. What are these terms? Well, a touch point is any time there is an interaction between us and our customer or end user. And a moment of truth is a particular type of touch point. It's where the customer has an opportunity to form an opinion, to form an impression about our brand, about our organization. But the totality of their experience is bigger than that. So we have to keep this in our mind as we work through the process. We also consider, as we're designing, are we creating ongoing mechanisms for customer and user interaction? So if we've got our customers and end users represented during the development process, that's great. But once we go live, are we continuing that dialogue? So that should be part of our design as well. Design for experience to create this feeling in our customer that we care and that we're continuing to communicate with them. Now, it might be for the customers, it might be having active business relationship management. It might be having regular communications about the quality and status of their services. With end users, it might be things like surveys or giving them information that tells them what happened in exchange for when they reported an issue or a concern. So keeping that dialogue going. But are we designing for that experience as part of our ongoing work? The next principle is work holistically. Now, this sounds a little new age, and we're all going to sit down and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But the key element here is that no service, no component, no process stands on its own. Services and even processes in many ways are complex systems that have to be thought of, considered, designed, deployed, managed with an awareness of the whole. Because changing one thing, one element in a complex system is going to have a cascade effect. Now, look at our little roads here, all connected. If you have to shut down traffic on one of them, there is going to be a cascade effect all the way out through the entire transportation system. So we have to really be aware of that. Well, how can we make sure that we are, as a team, working holistically throughout the process? It's very difficult to keep that big picture focus as we go forward. So the first and foremost is, everybody has to recognize and agree that it's important that we continually step back and look at the big picture. Now, one of the first things to do is look at our methodology, your project methodology, your CSI methodology, your workflows, and make sure we have the right connective tissue there. Do we have mechanisms in place as part of our methodology to put the pieces together and look at the big picture? Do we have the right communication techniques, the right ways of interaction between the various specialists or specialty areas on the team to make sure that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, and we don't, by, let's say, changing the system architecture, impact something else that needs to be done, or by changing a design element over here, impact data collection or reporting. So do we have the right mechanisms in place? And this is a really important one, are the mechanisms we have in place practical? Will they really work, or are they excessively bureaucratic, right? And consider that in those methods, are we balancing getting access to the right specialized skill sets and knowledge with proper collaboration and coordination? Everybody can't know everything. Everybody can't be a generalist. But at the same time, specialists can't work in silos, because if they do, we're not going to have that holistic overall view, the big picture of our environment, right? Another thing that can help is if there are conceptual models that help your team members wrap their brains around it. Some things like ITIL's 4 Ps of service design, Agile's minimum viable product concept. These things may help us to keep the team focused on the big picture and recognize, you know, if your focus is on the process, but are you considering how the people interact with the process? Are you considering how the tools are leveraged in the process, et cetera? And in minimum viable product, we're thinking not just of feature and functionality, but will a customer be able to use the features and functionality? Is there training that has to be done? Is there support that has to be provided? So are we really considering all the components that will make this product truly viable, right? So our next principle is progress iteratively. And this one is really hooked to agile and lean and even to DevOps principles as well. So this idea that we absolutely have to resist the temptation of trying to do everything all at once. You can't go straight from 0 to 100 without going through the intermediary speeds, right? So critical element to progressing iteratively is breaking up the work into manageable pieces. And each piece has to deliver something useful. Then we get that in place and we keep going. So many small efforts are going to combine to create a lot of change. And keeping that idea of minimum viable product can really help. I mean, if the product we're putting out there is the wagon on the left, I don't think we need the Maserati wheel on the right. That's not an appropriate minimum viable product for the solution. So let's make sure we're, understanding the need. Exactly what is the minimum you absolutely have to do to get that result in place. So how do we make this real? First of all, let's think about the iterations, the different cycles. When we break it down into the pieces can be executed sequentially, or some of them might be able to be done simultaneously. We have to look at whether or not there are dependencies. So that's one of the very important things to think about is, are there dependencies between these iterations? If we have a major initiative or program, we may be able to break that down into significant initiatives that are part of it, and then those in turn may have smaller efforts within them that can be coordinated and aligned depending on their relationships to each other. The key element here, we've got to go back to this all the time, is that each effort has to be manageable in scope and managed in such a way that it returns real results in a timely manner. So we can then build and build and build and build, but get that accomplishment. And one of the ways that this can be reinforced is by making sure that when something is accomplished, it is celebrated, and that we have communication about what's been accomplished and how it is of value. That's really important to making this real, this progress iteratively mindset. Now, one last thing about progressing iteratively. We have to keep in mind that there can be business issues that impact what we are able to do. So for example, if we are working on a system or a service that has a lot of regulatory control around it, and any changes have to be submitted and approved by regulatory authorities, etc., or if there are security things involved, there may be certain situations where we cannot make very, very small iterations. But even within a project like that, we may be able to work on the pieces internally iteratively, and then present the entire result to the regulatory body. So we have to consider all of the business issues that relate to this in order to be successful in progressing iteratively. Now, our next principle, this is the one we all pretend we know how to do, and then we don't do it. Keep it simple. Now, you'll notice, so as we're going through these relate to each other. Keeping it simple allows us to progress more iteratively. So this is all connected. I like this quote from Albert Einstein. Einstein. Everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. So yes, we have to get all the pieces in, but keep it as simple as we can. Do only what is necessary to consistently deliver the desired outcome. So we go back to focus on value. What is valuable? What are the required outcomes that our customer or business needs, and what is absolutely critical to delivering that and delivering it consistently? So in a process, we don't want to over-engineer the process. We don't have steps that aren't truly returning any value to us. In a service, the same thing. We're looking to make sure that the service is as efficient as it possibly can while still delivering the desired outcomes. So eliminate anything that can be considered wasteful, right? It's very much in sync with our lean principle. If a process, a service, an action, a metric, whatever it is you're focusing on, if it has no value or if it produces no useful outcome, it's gotta go. And we have to be ruthless about this, totally without ruth. So how do we make it real? Keep asking the question. Does this create value? Another way of thinking about it, particularly for a service, is this helping to create a service that is fit for purpose and fit for use? Or is this extraneous to that, the utility and the warranty, right? Always, as a principle, to be able to keep it simple, start with the simplest approach you possibly can. If you have to add any controls, any additional activities or metrics, only do so when you see that they're really needed. This happens a lot when we come to reporting, or also when we talk about putting controls on software. People try to overcomplicate. They try to put in every single bell and whistle. They try to restrict things that could be done through training and proper supervision. And they try to report on every possible metric that might be available in the world, whether they're truly of value or not. So we have to constantly ask that question. Why? How does this create value if it doesn't stop? Because if you overcomplicate, if you build in excessive bureaucracy and then try to back off later, that is nearly impossible. It's very, very difficult, right? Our next principle is collaborate. Yeah, we're rolling through these here. And this, again, is one of those things that's so challenging to do. So making sure we have the right mechanisms in place to work together and as creatively as possible towards that common goal. This goes back to a lot of things we've talked about, the focusing on value, having clear and consistent objectives and relevant objectives as one of our 5 things that we need to have. So there's a lot of connective tissue here between this. One of the values of working collaboratively with people is understanding that by working together, we create a shared commitment to the outcomes, and the results can benefit from having different perspectives that might not have been considered if we didn't have these other voices involved. Sometimes organizations are a little afraid of involving too many different voices because they don't want to expose the kind of ugly underpinnings. So finding those creative ways of involving people will get opportunities to get those interesting perspectives from unexpected sources. Inclusion is usually better than exclusion as a policy. Now, how about some practical guidance for making this real? First of all, we have to think through and identify who are all the real stakeholders here. And stakeholder literally is someone who has a stake in the work. Whether it's they're going to benefit from it or they're going to have to deliver the work, they are involved. Don't forget your suppliers. They may be involved. Don't forget indirect beneficiaries. So who are the people that have a stake in this? And based on what kind of a stakeholder they are, how are we going to manage their participation? So we need to understand for each group, what is their contribution going to be? At what level are they contributing? Are they a decision maker, so they're a strategic contributor? Are they a more tactical or a more operational contributor? And for each group, what are the most effective methods for engaging with them so that their participation can be easy for them? As you can see, this is very much part of organizational change management, or as we call it, OCM. Keep in mind that the scope of the collaboration has to vary based upon the scope of the impact of the change on the group in question. One last point to make here. Know the culture of your own organization. Some organizations are very consensus driven, but what can happen is, it's very collaborative, but it can take an excruciating long time. So you need to have strong governance mechanisms in place and an agreement about who will make the final decision and when they will have the authority to make that, so that we can drive forward action while still having the collaboration. Other organizations have a very kind of structured, top-down control kind of culture. If that's the case, then we're going to have to work very hard to include people at other levels in the collaboration. So again, it's got to be embedded into the work method to really make this real. The next principle is observe directly. This is very much out of Kanban and similar methods. Decisions need to be based on information that is factual as it can possibly be. So whenever possible, instead of relying on data or assumptions or anecdotes, we need to go to where this activity is occurring, and we need to observe it directly, or we need to directly measure things, not assume that old information is accurate. So this term of observing directly, in Lean, we call this either going to the source or going to the Gemba, right? So how do we make this real? Remember, data is not a substitute for direct observation. Whenever you can go and see for yourself, that's really important. And asking questions during that observation. Now, sometimes it can be helpful for some of the people doing the observation and asking the questions to have almost no knowledge beforehand of what is happening. Because sometimes, in addition to the people who do know what's going on, these newbies, if you will ask questions that will uncover things that are important for us to know, because they don't make any assumptions. So ask those why questions. Well, why are we doing it that way? There might be an important reason that has to be taken into consideration in the plan of action. But if we don't know not only what is being done, but why it's being done, then we can't do that, right? Also, it's very important to phrase questions in a way that will allow scope for the person answering and that will not influence the information that comes back. So asking something in a confrontational way will not be helpful. Asking something in flat yes or no questions is typically not useful. So find frequently open questions that allow the person who's answering it to kind of formulate their response and give them an opportunity to kind of editorialize a little bit, right? And again, this is very important. If you as a leader are always delegating and aren't going and observing directly yourself, then that behavior is not being modeled to your team members. So that's very important. And if you as a leader are jumping to assumptions, jumping to conclusions, then again, your people are going to try to filter what you learn and not really be open and honest. And be transparent. That is connected right into that. So being clear and being honest about what is happening and why it's happening is critical. First of all, it prevents rumors, because what happens when we don't communicate is rumors compete with the truth. And if we do communicate, people have the opportunity to really get involved appropriately. And when they speak about it, even if they're not directly involved, they're speaking from a position of knowledge. We know whenever change happens, there's going to be resistance. But if we communicate appropriately, if we're transparent as we possibly can be, then we're going to reduce the negative impact of resistance to change. It is going to happen. People are going to speculate about what's changing. They're going to speculate about how it impacts them. And our communication, our transparency is going to help to keep that in the right vein. So how do we do this? Well, again, it's part of communication and organizational change management. Consider what the appropriate degree of transparency is. And again, there are going to be organizational issues that impact this, such as confidentiality problems, trade problems, legal problems. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration, but be as transparent as we can within those constraints. What is the degree of transparency, the level of detail, and how we're going to communicate based on what's useful and what's required by the audience that we're communicating with. Make sure we consider all levels. There are communications to people at the same level and to lower levels, but also communicating appropriately up to organizational leadership can be absolutely critical to maintaining those leader supports and the commitments that we need. And even those leaders have to be part of this communication chain. So leaders at the different levels need to communicate out as part of this to the people that they have leadership over, so that we've got this comprehensive reinforcement of the messaging. And it'll give people an opportunity. So make sure also that accomplishments are communicated and celebrated, and that the method for people communicating bi-directionally is really well known, so that it's not just we're pushing out information, but that we're also listening. And when we hear things, we're transparent about what we're hearing and what we're doing about it. So those are the 9 guiding principles that are already defined in the ITIL Practitioner Guidance book, and that some of which I have been using for decades in business. Let's talk a little bit more about applying them, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So using the principles really helps to manage risk. We all are familiar with these issues that can arise if we don't appropriately handle these concerns and issues, things like going too far too fast. So these principles can help to build in to our work methods things that will prevent these risks from materializing. And hopefully you can see that we've already discussed most of these things along the way as we've been discussing the 9 guiding principles. Just like our systems also, these principles don't exist in isolation. They feed and support each other. So as we said, being transparent supports collaboration. Keeping it simple makes it easier to progress iteratively and work holistically. Designing for experience is part of really focusing on value. Again, we've got a huge interconnection between a lot of these principles, creating a system that will allow us to deliver better results over time. The principles will work best when they're embedded into standard work practices. So some of the things you can do: start every meeting in any kind of initiative or program with a quick review of the principles. Question any decisions or actions that are taken based on, do they adhere to the principles we all agreed to? And have those principles listed in all your literature. You know, put that as kind of one of the first slides in every deck you use, and that'll facilitate discussing them at the top of every meeting. This isn't War and Peace, but have them top of mind so people can reference them. And critical for those of you who are these leaders at whatever level, model the behaviors that you want your people to adopt. That includes the use of these principles. It's really critical that we model the behaviors that we're talking about. Okay? So in conclusion for our content here, using agreed principles to guide the efforts. This is really going to help you to embed those critical success factors into how you're working. And it'll really improve things. That's going to allow things to align with those initiatives being undertaken and make that initiative more successful by using those principles along the way. And using those principles will allow the outcomes to be better. It will also help to overall create a culture of excellence. And that culture will outlast any individual effort that you happen to be working upon. Okay? So it's time for us to open this up to questions.